Now here in the third part, we are going to start from here. The word convalescing. Now what did I explain you? What is the word convalescing meaning? Convalescing means recovering from illness. So the word convalescing seemed to be doing something to Mrs. Pumphrey. Obviously, when Mr. Heriot as a doctor is saying that Tricky is now recovering rapidly, this really brought a lot of satisfaction to Mrs. Pumphrey. It gave a lot of happiness and satisfaction to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. So now she has started giving fresh eggs, almost 12, 2 dozens, that means 24. 12 into 2, 24 a time, and she gave all these eggs. Why did she give? For Tricky's strength. So she is again going to feed Tricky in the same way as she used to do. For a happy period, my partner and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. So Mrs. Pumphrey was initially sending eggs, but now and as long as the eggs were coming, Mr. Heriot and Mr. Heriot's partner, they would be having 2 eggs each for breakfast. But as soon as the wine bottles started coming to hospital, then things started changing. Now what things started changing? We'll soon find out. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Why would Mrs. Pumphrey send the wine bottles? She would send to enrich Tricky's blood. Enrich means to make something good. To improve. Enrich is to improve, to make something better. So she wanted to improve Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meals. So now lunch was not a mere lunch, it was a ceremony with 2 glasses of wine before and numerous glasses while having the meal. So there is it's now a grand party for Mr. Heriot and Mr. Heriot's partners. We would hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. So earlier eggs, then wine, and now brandy. Now brandy has come. Why it has come? To improve even further Tricky's health, to sharpen Tricky's health. What? Tricky's constitution. Now constitution here means the blood. So Mrs. Heriot just wanted to improve Tricky's health, improve the blood condition, and so she's sending everything. She's not leaving a single thing. For a few nights, the fine spirits were rolled out and inhaled and reverently drunk. So they were having a gala time, a grand party for next few nights. There were days of deep content. Content means satisfaction. Starting well with an extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, finishing luxuriously round the fire with brandy. So now, initially it was just the breakfast with eggs. Now then they had the midday wine, lunch with the wine, and now even the evenings with the ending the evenings and the night with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that little dog had recovered and was waiting collection. So now Mr. Heriot is getting a little greedy. So he wanted to keep, actually he wanted to keep Tricky forever so that they can have this lavish party forever. But then Mr. Heriot knew that Mrs. Pumphrey is very worried about Tricky, and so he finally gives a call to Mrs. Pumphrey after 14 days, a fortnight. So after 14 days, he gives a call and he says that Tricky is waiting for a collection. So you should come and pick up Tricky. Within minutes, so as soon as the call went, within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up. outside the surgery. Now, what is this gleaming black metal? It's the black car, the luxurious car of Mrs. Pumphrey. So within minutes, there was a black shining car which had come outside the surgery. Surgery is the hospital. The chauffeur opened the door. Now you read this word as chauffeur. Chauffeur is the driver. So the chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make it out, the figures of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Heriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" So we can just see that Mrs. Pumphrey, she badly is in love with Tricky, and she just wants to know about Tricky's good health condition. So she asked Mr. Heriot, "Please tell me the truth. Is Tricky better now?" "Yes, he's fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." So Mr. Heriot, as a good gesture, says that Mrs. Pumphrey, you don't need to come out of your car. You can just sit over there. I will get Tricky for you. Go and get Tricky for you. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in the midst, ear flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. So when Mr. Tricky went inside, he saw that Tricky was playing with the other dogs, and he could be identified very clearly because his figure was a little different. He had a golden figure. His color was little golden. And he was very happy because he was waving his tail. The dogs are happy, then they wave their tails. So ears flapping, and he was playing with the friends. In the 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage in the front of his house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. So when Mr. Heriot went to collect Tricky and got Tricky, so as soon as Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, his mistress, he was also very happy. He could recognize Mrs. Pumphrey, and he just jumped from the lap of Mr. Heriot and from the arms of Mr. Heriot, and he ran to Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "ooh!" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So we know that dogs show their loving postures by licking their well-wishers. So he started licking, Tricky started licking Mrs. Pumphrey's face and then barking in excitement. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, and none of which had been used. So now Mr. Heriot, when these two people here, Tricky and Mrs. Pumphrey, were uniting, were meeting after so long, Mr. Heriot quickly assembled all the goods of Tricky, which Mrs. Pumphrey had given when Tricky was going to the hospital. So he collected everything, the toys, the bed, the coats, the cushions, and he had not used anything. So he just gave it back to Mrs. Pumphrey. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. And then the car started moving, and Mrs. Pumphrey just looked back towards Mr. Heriot just to say a thanks. That's a posture of thanks. And Mr. Heriot could see that tears were flowing down from Mrs. Pumphrey's eyes, and the lips were trembling. She could not even speak and say thank you. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is the triumph of surgery." So Mrs. Harriet now says that, "Thank you so much, doctor, that you have recovered Tricky, and this is the triumph of surgery." Now, so we see that what surgery actually was done. So Mrs. Harriet thought that a lot of medicines was used and a lot of treatment was done, but then in Tricky was actually put on a diet, a proper diet, and with lots of exercise. So that was the surgery which was done. So this is finally a triumph of surgery. Surgery over here means hospital, so it's a method of treatment over here, and so it's the triumph of the method of treatment, it's triumph of the hospital, it's triumph of the surgery, and Tricky is all well. So this finishes off the chapter, and we will do the question answers. Now I want you to really read the chapter very well and understand each and everything, because you know the questions are framed from anywhere from the middle of the chapter. It can be framed. So I don't want you to miss out any point. Please do the reading, and in case you have a problem, get back to me.